So I was on a phone call with one of my couples before their wedding, and they asked me, can you get us a photo under the stars? And I said, I mean, we can try, but I can't make any promises. I'm Nick Hilton, and in this video, I am showing you how I shot this epic astro portrait with just a single exposure. So this video is going to be broken down into two different parts. The first part is how to go about researching and planning for an astro portrait, and the second part is going to be about the actual execution of the image. And then at the end, I'm going to give you 3 bonus tips, so make sure you stick around for that. If you don't research and make a plan for these astro portraits, you're just going to waste your time. And so there's 3 key components that have to line up for an astro portrait to work. First is the location. We want to be somewhere with a dark sky. This means we don't want to be near any kind of city because the lights from the city will pollute the sky and basically hide the stars. There's a website called darkskymap.com where you can actually type in a place and then it will show you the amount of light pollution in that area. You also want this location that you choose to have a good view of the sky. You don't want to be inside a bunch of trees where you can't actually see the sky or the stars. So make sure you don't have big obstructions in your location. The second key component to making one of these photos work is going to be the sky itself. When it comes to the sky, the first thing I look for is there going to be something visually appealing in the sky? You know, for example, is the Milky Way going to be in view at this location, at this time of year, at this time of night? You also ideally want a new moon. A new moon would mean there's no moon. You want this because a moon, just like city lights, will pollute the night sky and it'll basically, again, hide the stars. You can just Google moon cycles and it'll tell you what dates those new moons are going to be on. An app that I really like to use is called Skyview, and Skyview will show you where different galaxies, constellations, planets, the moon, it'll show you where all of that stuff is going to be at a specific date and time. So let's go in, let's change the date on it. And actually I'm gonna keep the date the same, but let's just change the time. Let's change it to midnight. And so this is showing me where everything is going to be at midnight tonight. And if we look around, I can see, okay, there's like a small section of the Milky Way there. But then if I go down, there's the big pretty Milky Way. And so January right now would not be the best time of year in California to shoot photos of the stars, because if we look, the Milky Way is hidden at night. I checked this earlier today, and at about noon, the Milky Way was up in the sky, but of course it's daylight, so we couldn't see it. So this is a super useful app. All right, and the third key component that has to line up for this to work is the weather. You want a clear sky. You don't want any clouds, because clouds cover the stars for one, and when you do the long exposure, the clouds look like these ugly gray smudges. You know, a little cloud here or there is fine, but big clouds, it's just not gonna work. And also, because you're doing a long exposure, you want to try to have minimal wind, because if the wind is strong enough, it will blow the tripod around a little bit and potentially get some like camera shake in your image. So to recap, we want no clouds, no moon, no light pollution, and no obstructions, and if we can, no wind. Okay, so let me tell you, seeking out a star photo is one thing. You find a date where there's new moon, you find a location where it's going to be dark, you do it during a time of year where the Milky Way is gonna be, you know, beaming, and you're like, okay, that's when I'm gonna do it. And if the weather's clear, everything works out, you get a cool star photo, whatever. But when someone asks you to do a star photo on their wedding day, you don't get to seek out the date or the location or anything. It all just has to work. So I had to use my Skyview app and Google and the dark sky map to figure out if all of those things were going to line up on their wedding date. And it turns out there was going to be a new moon. Okay, no moon in the sky. Check. The Milky Way was going to be out. Check. Their wedding was in Mammoth Lakes, which, according to Dark Sky Map and my own personal experience, because I used to live there, is a very dark area, and so you have a very good view of the sky. And so since I knew all of these other things were going to line up, the day before the wedding, I used the Skyview app to figure out which direction I was going to have to face. That way I could pick a spot in Mammoth with a view. So I figured out the Milky Way was going to be southwest, and so I picked one of my spots that would, if I was facing southwest, I would have mountains in the background, I would see the Milky Way coming out of the mountains, and as long as the weather was good, we would be able to pull this off. But because I was still waiting on the weather, and we are going to be in the mountains, I still did not promise anything to my couple. However, the reception came to an end. It was perfectly clear skies, and so I said, hey, let's go right now. I've got a spot 5 minutes away. Let's do it. It's going to work. Because I had all the pieces. Now I just had to execute. Which brings us to part 2 of this video, which is the execution. So as I said at the beginning, this image is going to be a single exposure. It is not a composite. I did not take photos of the stars and then take a photo of them and then put it together. This is one single exposure. This is the straight out of camera. This is it edited. One exposure. And with this being a flash lit image, and from what we know about flash, we have to set our ambient exposure, which is going to be the stars and everything. And then we will add in our flash and adjust accordingly, so that way we can blend it, in camera. The first thing I needed to do was figure out that ambient exposure. I needed to get a good composition, and I needed to figure out my exposure for the stars. So I had the couple sit in their warm car, and I put my camera on a tripod, got a decent composition, and then I started with a 20-second exposure. I recommend 20 seconds to start with, because if you use more than a 20-second exposure, the stars will actually visibly move in frame. And if you use less than 20 seconds, you're not letting in enough light, and you'll have to up your ISO. Another way to avoid upping your ISO is lower your aperture pretty much as low as it can go. I'm using a 20mm 2.8 lens, so I had the aperture set to 2.8 to let the most light in possible. Focusing was not an issue, because with a wide angle lens, which you should be using for a star photo, a wide angle lens you can set to f2.8 or even f1.4 if you have one of those. Everything that's past like 3 or 4 feet, depending on the lens, if you put it at infinity focus, will be in focus. So my couple was like 10 or 15 feet beyond the camera, and then the stars, of course, are gajillion miles away. Everything was in focus, so I did not have to go to f8 or anything like that to get the whole thing in focus. So I locked in a 20-second exposure, and I set my aperture to f2.8, and then all I had to do was take a couple test shots and adjust my ISO accordingly, and I ended up with a 20-second exposure, f2.8, and an ISO of 1250. All right, that's my ambient exposure. That's the exposure that I would be getting without any flash added. Now, it was time to bring out the couple and get my flashes set. Pro tip, while you're figuring out your flash, you don't need that 20-second exposure. I turned my shutter speed back to like 1/125th of a second. That way I could quickly adjust my flash power and my flash position. And then once it was in place, all I had to do to bring those stars back was go back to that 20-second exposure. The flash power didn't change, nothing else changed. So that's a pro tip. So the flashes used for this, I used 2 Godox AD200 Pros. Each of them had a CTO gel. The reason for the CTO gel was that once I white balanced for the couple, the night sky would turn a little more blue. I had one flash on a stand about waist height back behind the couple, probably around 10 feet. And this one had a grid. I didn't originally have a grid on it, but I put a grid on it to limit the amount of light spill on the ground, because the ground was just a dirt road and I didn't need to see too much of that. But the whole point of the flash behind them was just to give them a rim light and separate them from the dark mountain background. Now the other flash you can see is the one that's lighting them up. And for this first image, it's a few feet away and it's just pointed down at them at about a 45-degree angle. This flash has the CTO gel on it, and it has a sphere. The Magmod sphere is designed to just soften the light just a little bit, just give a little smoother transition between light and shadow. And now I don't remember the exact power of each of these flashes, but that's not important because your settings would probably be different depending on your flash position and what flash you have. But I always start at 1/64th power and I just adjust up or down based on the results that I'm getting. All right, so with everything dialed in, I had them take off their jackets and I got this first shot in what I would call a safety pose. I said, okay, cool, got it. Then they asked if they could do more of like an adventure pose. They wanted to, do one as if they were walking. So I moved the flash further back and it was slightly off angle. You can see that it's not hitting their faces on this one. So then I adjusted the flash, upped the light power, and it was still wrong. It was hitting the groom, but not so much the bride. And so then third and final time, I moved the flash in a little bit closer and kind of aimed it more in the middle of them. And then boom, both of them were lit fairly well. And this is the final exposure that we ended up with. 3 final tips before ending this video. First tip, if you have an assistant with you, have them shine a flashlight on your couples. That way you can make sure you are always focused on them. Infinity focus can get a little weird, and sometimes the correct focus or the sharpest focus is actually right before infinity, not at infinity. So always double check your focus before you fire the shutter. Tip number 2 is to use a 2-second timer. That way when you click the button, it counts down 2 seconds and then the shot fires. You don't want to be clicking the button and immediately start that 20-second exposure, because if you bump the camera when you click it, your stars are not going to be sharp. And tip number 3 is to pick a pose that is easy for your couple to stay in for 20 seconds. Their face doesn't have to stay exactly the same. They can breathe. The flash does an excellent job of freezing them in place, but you still want them to stay pretty still so that way you don't get the ghosting and some weird like haloing type effects. All right, I hope this was helpful. That is how I achieved this Astro portrait in a single exposure. Please ask me any questions you have in the comments. I try to respond to them all. All right, see you in the next video.